How is it possible for 40 years of absolute communist control and strict indoctrination to vanish not in months but in just 10 days? And more importantly, how do you topple a totalitarian regime without firing a single shot? Shouldn't the fear, carefully instilled across generations, be an insurmountable obstacle? The answer lies in the surprising fragility of tyranny when confronted by the most unexpected weapon: civil unity, humor, and culture. To understand the fulfillment of the promise laid out in our title, Novi 17, 40 Years of Communism, fell in 10 days, we must travel to Czechoslovakia on November 17, 1989, when the Velvet Revolution reached its flashpoint. In just 10 days, millions of people utilized keys, church bells, and non-violent resistance, and the regime that controlled 15 million lives simply dissolved. Discover the full story of playwright Václav Havel and what truly happened on November 17th, when the Velvet Revolution marked the day that changed everything. But November 17th would not be just another student protest. It would be the spark. On that day in Prague, a seemingly innocuous student march, commemorating a student killed by Nazi occupation 50 years prior, rapidly became an explosion of outrage against the 4-decade-old regime. On Národní třída Street, the repression came brutally. Batons were raised, and rumors of a death spread like wildfire, electrifying the capital. The state machinery, built upon 41 years of fear and control by the STB, the secret police, seemed unbreakable. But within 48 hours, theaters emptied and streets filled. Activists and artists, led by the dissident playwright Václav Havel, formed the Civic Forum. The statistics are astonishing. Within just 72 hours after the first confrontation, over 75% of the Prague population actively supported the general strikes. Fear was broken. There were no mass shootings, no widespread bloodshed. Only the sound of bells and rattling keys, the sound of freedom being unlocked. In 10 days, just 10 days, the Communist Party completely ceded power. But how did an empire sustained by terror crumble so totally and so fast? The answer lay in the unexpected strength of the stage, the songs, and a people who finally, and en masse, dared to say, enough. Indeed, that power was waiting, latent, needing only the right catalyst. And it came, paradoxically, from an act of remembrance. November 17th, 1989. This gathering was not intended to be a revolution, but a solemn tribute. Approximately 15,000 students marched in Prague to honor Jan Opletal, a student killed by the Nazis in 1939, a historical footnote used as a politically safe pretense for assembly. But as the crowd swelled and the collective courage mounted, the authorized route was abandoned. They diverted towards Wenceslas Square, the historic heart of dissent, their chants quickly morphing from memorial hymns to demands for freedom and an end to the one-party state. The communist regime, accustomed to rigid control and the brutal silencing of the 1968 Prague Spring, reacted with predictable fear and force. At Národní třída, National Avenue, riot police blocked the path, forming walls of polyethylene shields. What followed was a planned, vicious crackdown known as the Národní třída massacre. Baton blows rained down on unresisting students. Historical estimates suggest up to 600 people were injured that night. Yet, this very act of state brutality intended to instill fear became the accelerant. The key fact that ignited the masses was not merely the violence, but the subsequent viral rumor of a student fatality, a fabricated story about Martin Schmid that spread like wildfire across the nation via radio and whispered word of mouth. The lie became more powerful than the party's truth. The transition, the true Velvet Revolution, began the very next morning, November 18th. Intellectuals, led by Václav Havel, a frequently imprisoned playwright now turned improbable hero, united with the students. In just 48 hours, the Civic Forum, Občanské Forum, was established, operating initially out of theater stages, the only venues where people dared to gather. This speed was the definitive plot twist. In 1968, Soviet tanks took months to crush the Prague Spring. In 1989, the apparatus of the communist state began its irreversible collapse in 10 days. The chronology is stark, November 17th, the violence. November 20th, hundreds of thousands gathered at Wenceslas Square. And November 27th, the massive general strike. The sound that defined those revolutionary days was not the deafening roar of tanks, but the distinctive jingling of keys. Hundreds of thousands of hands raised high, shaking key rings, a defiant symbolic gesture proclaiming, "Our door has been closed long enough. Open the doors and go home." On November 29th, 12 days after the initial student march, the Federal Assembly officially ended the Communist Party's monopoly on power. The regime, seemingly solid for 4 decades, crumbled. But why did the police, so brutally effective on the 17th, allow millions to assemble peacefully just 3 days later? What fatal weakness, hidden beneath the Iron Curtain's granite facade, allowed it to fall so utterly and so quickly? The flame that erupted on November 17, 1989, was not born in a vacuum. It was fueled by 2 decades of forced silence and a deep systemic rot. To understand why 40 years of control collapsed in just 10 days, we must rewind to the moment the previous hope died, the summer of 1968. After the Soviet tanks crushed the Prague Spring, the Czechoslovak regime entered the era of normalization. This was not just political repression. It was the deliberate intellectual and spiritual neutering of a proud nation. Unlike neighboring East Germany, which still maintained a semblance of economic efficiency, Czechoslovakia, historically an industrial powerhouse, saw its growth stall. By the late 1980s, the nation was trapped in stagnation, its technology decades behind the West, its infrastructure crumbling. The social contract was simple: keep your mouth shut and you'll keep your job. But the silence came at a terrible cost. Yet, even in the deepest freeze, resistance survived. In the shadows, a cultural resistance thrived, fueled by playwrights and poets, the most prominent being Václav Havel. Havel and his colleagues formed Charter 77, an underground movement demanding basic human rights. They knew they could not fight tanks with tanks, but they could fight lies with truth. They printed banned literature, samizdat, in clandestine apartments, circulating ideas that kept the promise of freedom alive, even if only among a few hundred intellectuals. But the party, led by hardliners like Miloš Jakeš, remained stubbornly blind. They were the last true believers, clinging to the Brezhnev doctrine, unaware that the world had moved on. The pivotal turning point lay outside their borders: Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost signaled to the satellite states that the Soviet tanks were staying home. When the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, Jakeš and his Politburo failed to read the writing on the wall. They believed the Czechoslovaks were too docile, too afraid of repeating 1968. They were catastrophically wrong. On November 17th, students gathered to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the anti-Nazi demonstration of Jan Opletal. What began as a solemn memorial quickly transformed into an anti-communist march. As they moved toward Wenceslas Square, Police cordoned off Národní třída. The resulting confrontation was brutal. Riot police savagely beat the unarmed students, shattering the illusion of normalcy. This act of violence was the spark. Reports, exaggerated by the powerful rumor that one student had died, immediately galvanized the nation. The students refused to back down, and on November 19th, activists, led by Havel, rapidly formed the Civic Forum, Občanské Forum. The people realized the party was fractured and powerless without Moscow's backing. They had been given a 10-day window, a moment of profound geopolitical weakness, and they seized it. The fear, carefully maintained since 1968, suddenly evaporated. The stage was set not for a protracted civil war, but for the most surreal transfer of power in modern history. But how do you dismantle 4 decades of totalitarian control not with bullets, but merely with keys and conversation? The answer lay in the perfect coordination between symbolism and decisive political action. The keys signaled the readiness, but the general strike was the checkmate. By November 20th, over 200,000 people filled Wenceslas Square. By the weekend, those numbers had swelled, driven not by uncontrolled rage, but by cold, unified determination. The regime, paralyzed by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the lack of Soviet backing, was brittle. On November 27, 1989, the nation stopped. The 2-hour general strike was a monumental, silent declaration of defiance. It cost the Communist Party its last vestiges of authority. No bullets, just profound, coordinated silence. This speed is the true plot twist of the Velvet Revolution. In just 1 or 10 working days, the span between the student protest and the general strike, the political landscape was irrevocably altered. By November 29th, the Federal Assembly rescinded Article 4 of the Constitution, ending the one-party monopoly. In a transition that feels impossible even now, Václav Havel, the dissident playwright who had been imprisoned merely months before, was elected president of Czechoslovakia on December 29th. 4 decades of rigid control vanished in 6 weeks. The lesson that fear can be broken quickly was learned, but freedom brought new, complex challenges. Without the Soviet ideological glue, historical tensions resurfaced. The subsequent debate over the country's name, Czechoslovakia, was a microcosm of deeper disagreements between the Czech and Slovak regions regarding economic reforms. Despite Havel's pleas for unity, the demand for sovereignty prevailed. On January 1st, 1993, the nation split peacefully, the Velvet Divorce. Today, the legacy is profound. Czechoslovakia, a nation previously confined behind the Iron Curtain, has morphed into 2 thriving democracies, integral members of the European Union. While the economic transition was painful, marked by privatization and initial instability, the long-term benefit is undeniable. GDP growth soared, and investment flooded regions once closed to the world. The Velvet Revolution proves that peaceful resistance can collapse seemingly eternal walls. Its cost, however, is the constant vigilance democracy demands. Yet, every tourist who walks through Prague, every student who studies freely, is a living testament to those who dared to jingle their keys. They didn't just demand change, they created a fundamental, non-negotiable break with the past. But what happened to the men who once held absolute power? And how did Europe react when this cascade of sudden freedom swept across the entire East? And so, against all expectations of the bloody repression seen in 1968, what unfolded was a triumph of non-violence. The regime, established firmly since the coup of 1948, did not survive the month. This is the essence of the plot twist. 40 years of ideological indoctrination and police control collapsed in less than 10 working days of massive protests. Between November 17th and November 29th, the day Parliament finally repealed the constitutional clause guaranteeing the Communist Party its monopoly on power, fear dissolved. It was proof that dictatorship is not an iron monolith, but rather a giant made of clay sustained solely by collective dread. The sound of bells and jingling keys, symbolizing closing time for communism, became the anthem of Czech freedom. Václav Havel, the skeptical playwright, assumed the presidency on December 29th, completing the political transition in just 42 days. The Velvet Revolution taught the world that cultural resistance and civil union can be more powerful than tanks, and that silence, once broken, turns into a roar capable of tearing down 4-decade-old walls. Fear, finally, was afraid. This was only one of the days that shaped our world. Tomorrow, we will publish another landmark historical event. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe now to The Day Everything Changed and turn on notifications. Which other day would you like to see featured here? Comment below.